Thank you so much for accepting my invitation to come into my classroom. We've been doing a lot of work with linear equations, but it's been kind of abstract stuff, and I know you've got a lesson where you're doing something concrete and more based in reality, so thank you.
You're welcome. I'm excited for the opportunity to work with your students and really work on performance tasks in general. I think this is going to be a great lesson and the students are going to learn a lot today. All right, so today your students are going to be working on a formative task called Consumer Sense, and the focus is really on linear equations. We know that linear equations is one of the new focus standards for the 8th grade Common Core math standards. I've been in your room and I've seen your students working on linear equations, but I'm wondering if you can tell me more about what you've done to help your students be prepared for today's formative task.
They've been doing linear equations all this year so far and just building their depth of knowledge with it. So far it's been very abstract though. We've been doing linear equations from the beginning of the year really. Just, it's very cyclical. So we've been revisiting it since August, and I'm sure we'll continue doing it in May, but in August we did just linear equations. We've been doing that. Yesterday we started doing systems of equations. So 2 lines on it in the point of intersection, and what does it mean where they intersect?
Okay, and that is another one of those shifts in the Common Core that we are working towards, really that equal balance of conceptual understanding, but also that application piece, because that's the piece that students are going to really need to know and be able to do to be successful in 21st century jobs, college, and really the world outside of the classroom. All right, so let's look at the task that we want students to complete today and go over kind of the content and the practices that we want to see them accomplish. Here is the task. I know you and I have both looked at it previously to make sure that it matched what we wanted to assess, but let's just take some notes on what we're hoping to see and hoping to encourage as they're working on the task. Let's just think first about the content. What's the content knowledge that you're really hoping your students demonstrate?
I hope that the students would be able to figure out which of the 3 internet plans would be most affordable or a best choice in different situations.
And how would you like to see them complete that? What's the math behind that that you think they would need to know?
The math behind it would be linear equations. So each of these plans, they cost a different amount per month or by the minute, and the students would need to come up with linear equations to be able to figure out, you know, when they graph it, like different points. Okay, how many minutes do I anticipate using this? Okay, so for me, this would be the best plan. Whereas, you know, if I had a big family, you know, they are over here, this would be the best plan. So just plotting this information out and making wise decisions as a consumer.
So on the student rubric, I've also listed them for students. There's 4 that I thought were the most relevant for this task. So the first would be constructing viable arguments and critiquing the reasoning of others. And I think you and I both saw that at the end of the task, which we liked. Model with mathematics, which you've touched on with the graphing. Look for and make use of structure. And look for and express regularity in repeated reasoning. So those are the 4 that I tied in there.
And I could see how all of these would tie in with the activity today, definitely, to different degrees.
Okay. When we are looking at constructing viable arguments and critiquing the reasoning of others, let's go ahead and look at where that would apply, because I think that's really one of the heart of the task. And from my perspective, it came in kind of typically as it usually does with tasks near the end, so 4, 5, and 6. When would the minute plan and the monthly plan cost Carlos exactly the same amount? So that really hits to me on the viable arguments.
I like how this is laid out, that depth of knowledge. It starts really superficial and kind of shallow, like how much did he pay for the service this month? Graph this, and it's kind of really low-level thinking at first, and then, you know, it deepens, and by the end we're getting to this thing where you have this graph, and, you know, where they intersect, you have to figure out, like, what's the best plan for this guy. So different standards would apply at different levels of the activity.
And when I have done performance tasks before, what I really like is they're typically built that way. So there's an access point for most students to get started. And I think that's key when creating really good math tasks, is that there's an entry point that students are comfortable and you build them up for success. So rather starting with the most difficult part of the task, starting with an access point and then building on that. It takes you all the way through to number 5, which is my favorite question. Carlos tells his friend that he has never exceeded 1,000 minutes in a month. That is why he has selected the unlimited plan. Carlos made a wrong decision. Explain what plan would be better for Carlos. So this is kind of that acknowledgement of someone made an incorrect calculation. What was incorrect about it? And I like that Common Core really pushes us there more than the previous standards did, because it's that analyzation that students can do now. What do you think they might use in order to prove that Carlos made a wrong decision on number 5? What should we be looking for?
Well, ideally they would go back to the graph or whatever sort of representation they use to compare these plans, and they would see that for 1,000 minutes, they would see which would be the more affordable plan rather than the unlimited plan, because he's not using enough minutes for it to be efficient.
All right, now that we've gone over the practices that we want to see students participating in, let's also look at the rubric on how we will be scoring. I've always been a really big fan of providing the rubric to students so they know exactly what they're expected to do. So we do have copies for the students to each be able to go through the rubric on their own to assess their own level of completion of the task. Numbers 1 and 2 that we talked about as kind of those easy access points are only worth 1 point each, just basically for the correct numerical value being calculated. Once we get into problem number 3 through 6, there's more steps, there's more thought involved, there's more mathematics involved, and those ones we allocated 2 points each. I think the concept of persevering in solving each problem is really important, because the problems do increase in difficulty, which is why the point value increases. Can you tell me a little bit about how you've prepared your students who are either struggling learners, long-term ELs, special education students, students that have just generally underperformed in math, and what has been going on in your classroom this year to prepare them for tasks like this?
Okay, well, you mentioned a pretty broad group there, just
right.
Students who are struggling. Small groups really help the students who struggle with math. With students who struggle with the language, I have some posters around the room and provide them with sentence frames for different ways that they could speak to each other and different ways that they could use vocabulary in the classroom.
Typically, when your students are taking formative assessments, I know that you've already set up a group dynamic in your classroom. Would this be an assessment that you would want them to participate as a group, or would this be something that you would typically want them to participate in on an individual level?
For this, I think I'd like them to try it as a group.
Okay.
Because there's a lot of deep depth of knowledge here on especially questions 5 and 6, and there could be great discussion there. So I think it would be good for students to bounce ideas off of each other.
I'm really interested to see what you think will be a struggle for them, or what they might need additional support with as they're working and getting assistance from their team and myself.
I think they're going to do really well with the problems where they have to assess which plan would be most cost effective. I think the struggle would be maybe in writing the equation for the different plans. Students, to this point, they have a lot of trouble distinguishing between the y-intercept and the slope of a line, and maybe they'll switch those up. And
okay.
So instead of, increasing by 3 every time, they're going to have it start at 3 on the graph. So they might make some mistakes in number 3 here. I'm not really worried about 4, 5, and 6, except for how they're based upon number 3. I think if they could get this number 3, everything after that would be fine. Because as much as they dislike having a classroom where I don't lead them by the hand and they have to think for themselves, as much as they dislike that, they're really good at it. And there are a lot of students that they get things like that and they actually say, wait, so what do I have to do? You mean that's the answer? I didn't do some like big long formula or something. So some of them are really good with it, but this is a struggle here, the equation.
All right, so when I start out talking with the students about the task, what I do plan to refer to help all students gain access and kind of a common ground and understanding of the task is already up on the board. I read initially, I also kind of thought, oh, it's a cell phone plan, but it's not. It's actually a tablet plan for the internet, which is even more accessible to them because they all have their smartphones now. But it occurred to me that maybe some students don't know what a tablet computer is or haven't called it that. They might just call it an iPad. So I actually printed out a picture and put it on the board so that the students can have a visual of what we're referring to. I also included the main standard that we'll be talking about and the task, which I also plan to put up in large print on the screen up there, and kind of walk the students through all of the tasks as well as the rubric before we get started in order to provide supports for students who either are struggling readers, who are the type of student who just wants to get started and maybe doesn't read all the way through. I think it's really important for students to understand where they're going, not just where they're starting. So going through all of the directions and making sure all the students are on the same page and all questions are answered before they get started. And then I'll also probably pause as we're working if there's a really big question that I think all students could benefit from hearing. Again, since this is a formative task and we really want to see what they know and understand and what they're struggling with so that we can come back and change instruction to really hit those areas that they struggled with, it's not that quiet test-taking environment where students are just hunched over their desk and working through it on their own. We really want to honor that there's a place for questions and that those questions can really benefit their teammates and maybe even the whole class. So as a guest teacher in your classroom, is there anything else you think that would be important for me to know about your students or the task in order for this to be a successful test today?
No, I think we've pretty much covered it, and I'm confident you'll do a great job.
Thanks, I'm really excited. I think this is going to be great.